Well, it's Big 12 tournament week, and I'm Pete Mundo. Heartland College Sports Weekly, of course, is the show that you've come to follow closely on the podcast, the radio show, and now YouTube and other places as well. We appreciate you being here, and it is the unofficial start of March Madness. Of course, that's next week. This week it is conference tournament week, the unofficial start to spring in my book. And before we bring on our guy, Matthew Postins, who you hear, of course, all the time on the show, let's remind you that we're brought to you by our friends at mybookie.com. And right now with the promo code BIG12, that's BIG12, you get a 100% sign-up bonus right ahead of March Madness. And they've got a pretty darn cool promotion going on right now. mybookie.com/mybracket. And they've got a $100,000 bracket contest that's only $10 to enter, or a $10,000 bracket contest that is $1 to enter. So our friends at MyBookie are taking care of you during this, which should be a very fun March. First off, Matthew, before we get to the season, the tournament, it was this week last year, you were in Kansas City, and the whole world shut down. It was Thursday morning of the Big 12 tournament. I'll never forget, Texas and Texas Tech were on the court, and you and I got beers that afternoon and kind of wallowed in our sorrows, so to speak. None of us saw the past year coming, but what do you remember most about that Big 12 tournament last year?
Yeah, it was a year ago Friday of this week, as a matter of fact, March 12th. I think the thing I remember most about that day was they had contracted the crowd for that Thursday. It really kind of limited it mostly to family, friends, and team officials. And I didn't even know about the state of emergency that the Kansas City mayor had declared that morning until, I grabbed my lunch and went to my seat courtside. Texas and Texas Tech were warming up. And then somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Bob Bowlesby's going to talk in about 5 minutes. You might want to go back to the press room." And I'm like, "Oh, crap."
Yeah.
There we go. And yeah, they canceled the tournament. And then later that day, I was in the bar at the Marriott with West Virginia fans, and they canceled the whole shooting match. And it's crazy to think it's been a year. I mean,
Yeah.
I think on the whole, everybody has handled this about as well as they could have handled it.
Mm-hmm.
From a
isn't it
athletic
one of those
perspective.
things? In a weird way, it feels like it was just yesterday, but then in a weird way, it feels like it was 10 years ago. Like, it's one of those things to me where I remember sitting there with you, grabbing those beers, and then I'm also like, well, it feels like another lifetime. So that's what's kind of weird about this whole thing.
Yeah, there is some weird spatial relationship there, because it does feel like it was a couple of weeks ago. I'm back here in Texas now. I'm not going to be at the tournament this week in person, which I hate, but that's just how it is right now. But I've turned my room in the back of my house into an office. I've got a standing desk. I've got this behind me. I've worked at home since I got back from Kansas City. That was the last sporting event I've been to.
It's crazy. It's absolutely
in the last
crazy.
year. And I'm hoping, maybe to start hitting games again in May. That's where I love being. And, I wish that I could be a part of it this year in person, but next year, we got a sub-regional here in Fort Worth, and we got a regional in San Antonio. So hopefully we'll have some Big 12 teams there.
Looking forward to that. Well, we could have a lot of Big 12 teams going pretty deep in March this year. Let's just talk big picture here with the Big 12. I mean, all the bracketology that you and I are looking at this week shows 7 Big 12 teams making the tournament. To me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, there's nothing that can change this week, barring a Kansas State or, TCU or Iowa State winning the conference tournament that changes 7 teams from the Big 12 being in the big dance. So what is this week all about to you? Is it really just about a seed here or there that a Texas Tech can maybe work its way to a 3 seed if it wins the Big 12 tournament? Because to me, that's really all that's at stake because of how good this conference has been.
Yeah, I think it really is about seeding, and I think it's really about seeding for Texas Tech. Like you said, they could slide up a spot or two with a good tournament, but it's also for Oklahoma too, because a few weeks ago, I think you and I talked about, Joe Lunardi and Jerry Palm. They had a real distinct difference on how they looked at Oklahoma State. I think Palm had them at a 4, and Lunardi had them at an 8. Well, they're together now. They're at a 4 now. Oklahoma State is. Oklahoma's now the team where they have a disparity. I think Lunardi has them as a 6 and Palm has them as an 8 now, or vice versa. But so there's a little disparity now in how they look at Oklahoma. So oddly enough, winning that game against Iowa State's important, because it just gives them another victory to kind of lean on, even though it's against a 2-win team. And it also gives them a pathway into that game with Kansas on Thursday, which is a game that I think is winnable for Oklahoma. I think they're the team maybe like West Virginia a couple of years ago that, got out of that first day and got to the semifinals. I think they're the team that can get out of that first day, obviously, and get to the semis, because I think Kansas is a favorable matchup for them.
And you mentioned they're a team that I could spend this entire conversation talking about, and that's Oklahoma State. This team, and I admit it, Matthew, I thought this team would have a nice little run, maybe with Cade Cunningham, maybe get a 7 seed out of this March Madness and maybe win a game or two. And then Cade's gone. And then it's like, okay, what's next for Mike Boynton? Whose uncle can he hire to try to get a 5-star guy? I mean, I was so wrong. This team, like, they're not the best team in the Big 12, Matthew, but right now I believe Oklahoma State is the most fun team to watch in the Big 12. Do you agree with that, or is there somebody else you'd go to?
They're a lot of fun to watch. And I think what's happened over the course of the season, if you go back to bracketology in January, they weren't in either bracket. And then when they finally got into the bracket, they were like in one of those 11 or 12 seed play-in games. And now they're a 4. And what's happened really is, obviously, Cade Cunningham has been a very consistent contributor for them all season. He's been one of the best players in the country. But what he's done also is he's also siphoned off a lot of that attention that would normally be put on the rest of the team. So guys like Rondell Walker and Avery Anderson, if you watched the West Virginia game Saturday, your eyes probably came out of your head with Avery Anderson scoring 31 points. But he's a really good player. The Boone brothers, Matthew Alexander Moncrief. Cade Cunningham has made them a better team this year and made them a really fun team to watch. But he's made them a better program for the next couple of years, because all of those different guys have grown up and they're all coming back next year. Oklahoma State, with that combined with, maybe getting a scholarship or two back that Boynton can recruit with in the spring off the back of Cade Cunningham, it's going to make them a better program the next couple of years.
And here's what's amazing too about Mike Boynton, and there's already talk about, South Carolina, if they move on from Frank Martin, they cannot, to me, with how the Brad Underwood thing went down, they cannot suffer another disaster like that, like this would be. I mean, if they were to lose Mike Boynton, that would be a failure of epic proportions by Mike Holder. So they got to do everything they can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, if the South Carolina job opens up, that's an important part of Mike Boynton's journey. He was an assistant coach there. He has a long relationship with the folks at South Carolina. So if that job opens up and he says, okay, I'm going, quote unquote home, even though he's from Brooklyn, New York, then, fine, that's cool. But if he doesn't go to South Carolina, they cannot have what happened with Brad Underwood happen to Mike Boynton. That cannot happen again. And if that happens again, then the folks in charge at Oklahoma State need to take a long, hard look at Mike Holder and just say, dude, are you kidding me?
What are you doing?
You let Brad Underwood go and he built a top 5 program at Illinois. What's Mike Boynton going to do if he goes to another Big Ten school or another SEC school and built a powerhouse there? It would show me that all Mike Holder really cares about is football.
Yeah.
And at Oklahoma State, that's a crime, because they have a long history of being a very good basketball program.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't get enough credit for the basketball history that they have there in Stillwater. Let's talk about the team they're going to be playing, West Virginia. That's the first game on Thursday morning once we get to the quarterfinal matchups in the Big 12 tournament this week. But what do you see from the Mountaineers here as of late? A surprising loss over the weekend. Bob Huggins did not get win number 900. So where is West Virginia right now as they hope? I mean, every team wants to peak right now. Where do you think the Mountaineers are?
I still think they're in a good place. I mean, they played Baylor that previous Tuesday. They went to overtime. They played a really good game. I mean, if you watch that game start to finish, West Virginia played very well. I still think they're capable of getting to the championship game. I still think they're capable of beating Oklahoma State on Thursday. It's just with that loss to Oklahoma State, that really hurt them, because now they got to play Baylor in the semifinal game, which is, maybe that's what they want. But, their perimeter players are playing at a very high level right now. Derek Culver is an all Big 12 first team player, and justifiably so. He's had a great year. They've got good depth. They can compete with anybody in this conference. Their trick is they've got to keep Derek Culver out of foul trouble. Gabe Osaboyan is a very good player. He does a lot of good things for them, but he doesn't create his own shot. He doesn't work off the block. He basically gets his points off second chance points and turnovers. So if Culver has to spend long stretches on the bench, and that was part of the problem with Oklahoma State on Saturday, Culver had to spend a lot of time on the bench due to foul trouble. If I'm Oklahoma State, that's my plan early on Thursday. Drive the ball at Derek Culver every single time, get him in foul trouble, get him off the floor. Then it becomes a game that really is in your favor at that point.
The other game that we know is going to be taking place on Thursday is Texas and Texas Tech. So as you look at these two teams and this game in particular, I mean, it seems like the shine has kind of worn off the Longhorns here the last few weeks. Texas Tech, we know what Chris Beard can do. They've got experience, obviously, in March. What are these two teams looking for this week in this Big 12 tournament?
Well, I think for Texas, they had a good week this past week. They won 3 games, but I think if you look inside the game, their balance is back between their front court and their back court. They got really backcourt heavy for a couple of weeks there. And I think that's part of the reason why they had such a rough stretch in the middle half of February. Now that they've got their balance back between Jericho Sims and Kai Jones and Greg Brown and 3 tremendous guards, that really helps them going into the Big 12 tournament, because that's when they're at their best, when they don't have to lean on one, either their perimeter or their inside game. For Texas Tech, the trick has been they have these games where they always play great defensively, but they had these games where they don't play at a high level offensively, or maybe just Mac McClung has a really good game offensively and the rest of them are just kind of middling. They just haven't been able to get consistent in that respect this year. I think in part because while they haven't had a COVID pause, practically every other COVID pause in the conference has impacted them in some way by having games canceled or games postponed. So they just haven't been able to get into a rhythm. So if I'm Texas Tech this week, I want to get my offense back into a rhythm as much as I can. And they can do that against Texas because Texas is one of those teams who the last few years, they've just had the Longhorns number. And their one meeting in Austin earlier this year, they won that game at the buzzer on a Mac McClung 3-pointer. I think Tech has now won either 4 of the last 5 or 5 of the last 6 meetings with Texas. So wouldn't surprise me at all if Texas Tech won that game, but I'm banking on Texas and the rhythm they've created the last week to kind of carry them out of that round and into the semifinals.
Do you think, Matthew, that, both of these teams, obviously it's about seeding. We talked about Tech earlier, maybe bumping up a seed or two. Is Texas at the point where it's still a team that has some pieces that have matured, but these guys obviously have not played any type of length of the NCAA tournament? Do they need a win or two here this week if you're Shaka Smart, just to build a little bit of confidence going into March Madness and the NCAA tournament next week, or is that stuff overrated?
I don't think it's overrated in this case. I mean, I think they're a team that, depending upon what happens across the rest of the country, if they can make a run and go to the championship game, they could conceivably slide into a 2. I think that'd be a bit far-fetched, but I don't think you want to be Shaka and lose that first game against Texas Tech and drop to a 4, because again, that means a Sweet 16 game against a 1 seed. Maybe it's a Gonzaga, maybe it's an Illinois, maybe it's a Michigan. Not saying that's not a winnable game for them, but it makes their road very difficult at that point, as it should be in the Sweet 16. If I'm Shaka, I want to win out and get to the championship game and build that momentum up, because like I said, they're a team. You could see it last week. The pieces are starting to come back together for them. And I think the last thing you'd want if you were Shaka Smart would be to lose that game against Tech and have to sit for basically a week, because as you reminded me the other day, the NCAA tournament starts on a Friday this year, not a Thursday.
Yeah. That's the only weird thing about this year. That and, only 25% fans is going to throw me off. But the team, you just mentioned some 1 seed possibilities. Let's dive into the 1 seed here, the Baylor Bears. It does seem like, Matthew, that as people go to fill out their brackets next week, there's going to be a lot of 1 seed love. It feels like there's a big drop off when you get from Baylor, Gonzaga, Illinois, Michigan, whatever order you want to put them in, to what feels like the rest of the field, right? So is Baylor in a position, though, where if they have a horrible week, because, it's been such a disjointed last few weeks for them, where they could fall off that 1 seed line if they do lose to a West Virginia on Friday? Is that a possibility?
I don't think so. Everything that I've heard from Joe Lenardi and Jerry Palm tells me that even if Baylor were to lose in the quarterfinals to Kansas State,
all right, you calling
Lon
it?
Gordon. You think you can win the whole thing? Go prove it.
Yeah.
But even if they were to lose in that first round, they seem to think they wouldn't fall off that 1 line. Now they might fall into that region opposite Gonzaga, which I think is what Baylor wants to avoid. They want to avoid being in that region opposite of Gonzaga, so they meet in the national semifinals as opposed to the championship game. But I don't think that Baylor can really hurt themselves too much this week, with a loss, especially a semifinal loss to West Virginia. I don't think the committee is going to penalize them that much for losing to what at that point would be a top 10 West Virginia team.
Do you think they have to prove to themselves, though, that they are the team that they were before the 3-week shutdown?
I think they've proven that this past week to
Okay.
themselves. Beating 3 ranked teams. I mean, the way that Big 12 reset the schedule, they basically said you're going to play number 6 for West Virginia, you're going to play number 17 Oklahoma State, you're going to play number 18 Texas Tech. Good luck, and they won all 3 games. So I think they're the Baylor team that we were used to seeing before they went on the COVID pause. So I don't. And they're so mature too. I mean, when you think about the players that have been there for 2-3 years now, they're such a mature team. Nothing really seems to rattle them. So I don't think that this week's about proving anything to themselves or to anybody else.
Matthew, before we look at the rest of these teams in the Big 12, I was thinking about this because I saw this on Twitter, some chatter, how the Big 12 this year in basketball is like the SEC is in football, where they've got one team that can win a national championship in Baylor in this case, and then a lot of really good teams, but no one who's a national title contender. When Kansas is your 2 seed in the Big 12 tournament, is there something to be said for the gap in the Big 12 between 1 and 2 is bigger than the gap between 2 and 6? Is that fair? Or do you say no? I mean, Kansas or Oklahoma State or West Virginia or Texas Tech. I mean, no, if they're in an Elite 8 or even a Final Four, I'm not shocked.
I think there's 5-6 teams capable in the Big 12 of getting to the Sweet 16, and I think there's at least 3 or 4 that are capable of getting to the Elite 8. I don't think there is a gap between Baylor and everybody else. Let's just be honest, there is. But there's not a gap between Kansas and West Virginia and Oklahoma State and even Oklahoma between them and among the rest of the country. That's why most of them have been, no worse than a 5 or a 6 seed all season when it comes to the brackets over the last month. They are good enough and they're competitive enough to get to a Sweet 16 or an Elite 8. It's really going to boil down to how the bracket falls. If, for instance, if 3 of those Big 12 teams somehow end up in that region with Gonzaga, it's going to be hard for any of them to get out of there. But if they balance it out a little bit to where Baylor's in a region with 1 Big 12 team and there's 2 down here and there's 2 down here and maybe 3 up here, I could see the possibility of 3 Big 12 teams getting to the Elite 8. I don't buy the logic that just because there's a gap between Baylor and everybody else that those other teams can't get far in the tournament.
I could not agree more. Now, we haven't really talked about the bottom tier of this conference. And we'll find out more probably this week about what the future holds for Bruce Weber at Kansas State and Steve Prohm at Iowa State. It seems like Jamie Dixon is fine at TCU, but still, those 3 teams at the bottom of the conference right now, if you were to say, hey, this is the one of those 3 that I really just don't like the direction of the program, which one is it?
That's probably Iowa State.
Yeah,
that's not a hard question to answer when you win 2 games in 1 year.
But do you see anything there where you're like, there's a glimmer of hope, or do you like the young roster that Bruce Weber's put together better than Steve Prohm's young roster?
Oh, I absolutely love what Bruce Weber's brought in to Kansas State between Nigel Pack and some good building blocks in Davion Bradford and Selton Miguel. DeJuan Gordon has had a very good year. They've got a lot of really good young pieces. Now Bruce Weber has to spend the offseason putting those guys together. What Iowa State's problem is right now is they had the transfer problem like Kansas State did, but Kansas State brought in a whole group of players, like 7 or 8 guys. Iowa State brought in a few guys and a couple of transfers, and their centerpiece of their recruiting class, Xavier Foster, hurt his foot in December. That hasn't played the rest of the season. Rasir Bolton got hurt for the last few games of the year. There's not a lot of young talent on that team right now, and that's the concerning thing to me. If I look at their starting lineup next year, it's Bolton, and it's Trey Jackson, and it's Chris Harris, and then Nate Hinson, who had to sit out the year due to an illness. They don't really have a big guy unless Foster comes back and he's healthy and ready to go. They've got 1 player in their recruiting class for 2021 right now, a top 100 guy, but just 1 guy right now. And there's just not a lot of young talent to build around right now on that team. That could change depending upon what happens in the offseason. But of those 3 teams, they're the ones that I'm the most worried about, because I don't see a young freshman or sophomore there like I do at Kansas State or even at TCU with Mike Miles that you can build around.
All right, Matthew, we got a couple minutes here. Give me I was looking this up here, and when's the last time a team not named Kansas, Missouri, or Iowa State won the Big 12 tournament?
Oh gosh, I was actually looking at this the other day. I think it was Oklahoma State.
Give me a year.
They won back-to-back. I think it was 04.
0405. Well done.
Yeah,
Nice
close.
job by you. Nice job by you. 2005, 04 and 05, Oklahoma State did win back-to-back Big 12 tournaments. Since then, it's been Kansas, Missouri, or Iowa State to win every Big 12 tournament. So make the case. Who do you see winning the Big 12 tournament this year?
I'm going to stick with the 1 seed, Baylor.
Okay.
Baylor's never won a tournament. For that matter, no team from the state of Texas has won a Big 12 tournament to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of feel like they have everything they need. It's not to say they couldn't lose a one-off game against a West Virginia or a Texas. In fact, that's who I'm picking to get to the championship game. It's Baylor and Texas. That's my pick to get to the title game. And in that kind of a game, I just feel like Baylor's experience, their ability to shoot at a high level. One thing we haven't talked about, we talk a lot about Jared Butler and Davion Mitchell and Maceo Teague. There are 5 players in that team that shoot better than 40% from the three-point line. The other 2 guys are Adam Flagler and Matthew Mayer. They've got a stretch 4 forward and 4 guards that can shoot better than 40% from the three-point line. That's almost impossible to deal with defensively. And to me, that's going to be the big problem that any team in the Big 12 tournament's going to have, and any problem that any team in the NCAA tournament's going to have with them. They've got to hope that Baylor has an off night from the three-point line. And I don't expect that to happen this week. I think they're going to win their first Big 12 tournament and just keep on rolling.
All right. Well, I like that. I'm going to go Baylor over Texas Tech in the Big 12 tournament on Saturday night in the championship game. That's my prediction. I think that Tech can get by Texas in that first quarterfinal matchup. Kansas, I'm not in love with right now, advance to that semifinal. And then you've got Baylor over Texas Tech. So there you have it. Big 12 tournament here on Heartland College Sports Weekly, part of heartlandcollegesports.com. I'm Pete Mundo. He is Matthew Postins. Enjoy the games. We'll be doing this after Selection Sunday comes out as well. So we'll see you then on the podcast, also on YouTube and everywhere else that you are getting our content. Matthew, we'll talk to you on Selection Sunday, my friend.
You bet, Pete. Appreciate it.